The double doors of Riverside Care Home in Atlanta, Georgia burst open on a humid Tuesday morning in late August, and three uniformed military officers walked through with an authority that made every conversation in the lobby fall silent. Their boots echoed against the linoleum floors like thunder before a storm, and the lead officer, a decorated colonel with steel-gray eyes and ribbons covering his chest, approached the reception desk where Denise Matthews, the facility administrator, sat frozen with her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "We're here on official military business," the colonel announced, his voice cutting through the air-conditioning hum and soft elevator music. "We need to speak with a young woman who works here, a caregiver named Keisha Williams, and we need to see the patient in room 217 immediately." Denise's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup, her eyes darting between the three officers and the handful of visitors and staff members who had stopped moving, stopped breathing almost, everyone sensing that something monumental was unfolding right in front of them. Keisha was on the third floor when her supervisor called her, finishing up her morning routine with Mrs. Patterson, who had difficulty swallowing her medications, taking extra time as she always did to make sure the elderly woman felt cared for and not rushed. At 23 years old, Keisha had worked at Riverside for almost 4 years, ever since she dropped out of nursing school when her mother got sick, and the medical bills started piling up like autumn leaves that just kept falling no matter how many times you cleared them away. She loved this job despite the exhausting shifts, despite the way some of the wealthier families looked at her when they visited their relatives, their eyes sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture or a shadow on the wall, invisible except when they needed something. Her supervisor's voice on the phone was strange, tight with something Keisha couldn't identify, and when she said, "You need to come to the main floor right now, and Keisha, there are military officers here asking for you," the younger woman felt her heart drop into her stomach like a stone thrown into deep water. The walk to the elevator felt like moving through thick honey, her mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Her younger brother Marcus had enlisted in the army 2 years ago and was stationed somewhere she couldn't pronounce in the Middle East, and every time her phone rang at an odd hour or someone official-looking came around, her first thought was always Marcus, always fear dressed up in uniform coming to deliver news that would shatter what was left of her world. The elevator descended with agonizing slowness, and Keisha caught her reflection in the polished steel doors, seeing the fear naked on her face, her cornrows pulled back neatly as they always were for work, her light blue scrubs clean despite having already worked 5 hours of her 12-hour shift. When the doors opened and she saw the three officers standing in the lobby, their presence seeming to fill the entire space, she had to grab the elevator frame to steady herself, her legs suddenly feeling like they might give out beneath her. "Are you Keisha Williams?" the colonel asked, his voice softer now, gentler than when he'd announced himself to Denise, and something in his eyes wasn't the hardness of a man delivering a death notification but something else entirely, something that looked almost like respect or maybe even awe. Keisha nodded, not trusting her voice, her throat tight and dry. "Ma'am, we need to talk to you about the patient you've been caring for in room 217, Mr. James Morrison," the colonel continued, and the relief that flooded through Keisha was so intense she almost laughed, almost cried, because this wasn't about Marcus. Her brother was safe. But then the confusion hit her because why would military officers be here about Mr. Morrison, the quiet old man with cloudy blue eyes who everyone else treated like he was already a ghost? Already gone even though his heart still beat, and his chest still rose and fell with each labored breath. Room 217 had been Keisha's special responsibility for the past 18 months, ever since James Morrison had been transferred to Riverside from a veterans hospital in South Carolina. A frail man in his late 90s who came with almost no personal effects, no family contacts, no visitors ever, just a social worker who dropped him off and a thin file that listed his basic medical needs and nothing else. The other caregivers avoided room 217 when they could because Mr. Morrison was difficult. They said, because he sometimes got confused and agitated, because he had nightmares that made him scream words in languages some of them couldn't identify, because taking care of him was hard work for someone who had nobody, who would never complain to management, who would never leave a tip at Christmas like some of the wealthier patients' families did. But Keisha had been assigned to him on her first day taking his care rotation, and something about the old man had grabbed hold of her heart and wouldn't let go. She remembered that first morning so clearly, walking into room 217 expecting to find just another elderly patient, another person at the end of their story, but instead finding a man who looked at her with eyes that seemed to carry entire lifetimes behind them. Oceans and mountains and battles and victories and losses, all swimming in those cloudy depths. He had been sitting by the window even though he could barely see through the cataracts, his thin shoulders bent but not broken, and when she'd introduced herself, he turned and studied her face for a long moment before saying in a voice rough as gravel but somehow warm, "You have kind eyes, young lady. That's rare. That matters." From that moment, Keisha had decided that James Morrison would never be just another patient to her, would never be forgotten or neglected or treated as less than the human being he was, regardless of whether he had family or money or anyone in the world who remembered his name. The months that followed had created a bond that Keisha couldn't quite explain to anyone who asked. Not that many people did ask, because most of her coworkers thought she was wasting her time and energy on someone who couldn't benefit her in any tangible way. She started arriving 30 minutes early to her shifts just to have coffee with Mr. Morrison, learning how he liked it, black with 2 sugars, the cheap cafeteria coffee that he drank like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted. She brought him books from the library, even though his eyes couldn't manage the small print anymore, and she would read to him during her breaks, mostly westerns and war histories that he seemed to enjoy, his face becoming animated in ways it never was with anyone else. She learned his preferences and his routines, learned that he slept better with the window cracked open even in winter because he said he needed to hear the world, learned that he had nightmares every few nights that left him shaking and disoriented, crying out names and coordinates and orders that Keisha didn't understand, but that clearly still haunted him across the decades. The other staff members thought she was being too attached, too invested, and Brenda, one of the senior nurses who had worked at Riverside for 15 years, had pulled Keisha aside one day and said with a mixture of pity and condescension, "Honey, you can't save them all, and you especially can't pour your heart into the ones who have nothing to give back. Mr. Morrison doesn't even have enough in his account for a decent funeral when his time comes. You're young and you work too hard for someone who will never be able to help your situation." Keisha had just smiled politely and nodded, but inside she had felt a flash of anger because why did everything have to be transactional? Why did kindness have to come with an expected return on investment? Why couldn't taking care of another human being be enough of a reason all by itself? She had gone back to work and continued giving Mr. Morrison the same care and attention she always had, maybe even more just to prove something to herself about who she was and who she wanted to be in a world that seemed increasingly determined to put a price tag on everything, even compassion. But there had been moments, small moments that Keisha had noticed and filed away without quite understanding their significance. Moments when James Morrison seemed like more than just a forgotten old veteran at the end of his days. There were the scars that covered his body, not the typical injuries of age but deliberate marks of violence, bullet wounds and knife scars and burns that suggested a life lived in harm's way more often than not. There was the military tattoo on his left shoulder, faded now but still visible, showing an insignia that Keisha didn't recognize but that looked official and important somehow. There were the nightmares where he shouted coordinates and tactical commands with an authority that seemed to transcend his current frail state, his voice in those moments becoming the voice of someone who had commanded others, who had made life and death decisions, who had carried weight that most people couldn't imagine. There were the few photographs he kept in his nightstand drawer, pictures so old they were more brown than black and white, showing a young man in uniform standing with other soldiers in locations that could have been anywhere. The back of one photo bearing the handwritten date 1944 and nothing else. Keisha had asked him about his past a few times, gently, never pushing because she sensed that some doors were closed for good reasons. But Mr. Morrison would just shake his head and say things like, "That was a long time ago, sweetheart, and some stories are better left buried with the men who lived them." Once, during a particularly bad nightmare when Keisha had stayed late to comfort him, he had grabbed her hand with surprising strength and looked at her with tears streaming down his weathered face and said, "I did things that needed doing, saved people who never knew they needed saving, and I lost brothers whose names I still hear every night. But you remind me that there's still good in this world, still people who care for no reason except that it's right." She had held his hand until he fell back asleep, and she had cried quietly in the hallway afterward, feeling the weight of his words and the honor of being trusted with even that small glimpse into the pain he carried. Now, standing in the lobby with these three officers looking at her with expressions she couldn't read, Keisha felt all those moments clicking together like puzzle pieces, forming a picture she still couldn't quite see, but could sense was bigger than anything she'd imagined. "Can you take us to Mr. Morrison's room?" the colonel asked, and it wasn't really a question, but it was asked politely, with a deference that seemed strange coming from someone of his obvious rank and authority. Keisha nodded and led them to the elevator, aware of Denise and the other staff members watching with open curiosity, their faces pressed with questions they didn't dare ask out loud. The ride up to the second floor was silent except for the mechanical hum of the elevator, and Keisha could feel the tension radiating from the officers, a mixture of anticipation and something else, something that felt almost like nervousness, which seemed impossible because what could make men like this nervous about visiting a forgotten old man in a care home? Room 217 was at the end of the hallway, and as they approached, Keisha could see through the open door that Mr. Morrison was in his usual spot by the window, his wheelchair positioned so he could feel the sun on his face even if he couldn't see it clearly. She knocked gently before entering, a habit she developed because dignity mattered even when someone was dependent on others for their basic needs, and she said softly, "Mr. Morrison, you have some visitors." The old man turned slowly, and when his eyes, cloudy as they were, settled on the three uniformed figures entering his room, something happened that Keisha had never seen before. James Morrison, who could barely stand without assistance, who needed help with almost every aspect of daily life, straightened in his wheelchair with a posture that was suddenly rigid and military, and his right hand, shaking with Parkinson's but determined, rose to his forehead in a salute that was crisp and perfect and spoke of muscle memory, so deep that 90-plus years and countless physical ailments couldn't erase it. The colonel stepped forward and returned the salute with equal crispness, and then did something that made Keisha's breath catch in her throat. He stood at attention and said, "Colonel James Ghost Morrison, serial number 32,158,796. It is my profound honor to finally find you, sir." The other two officers also stood at attention, and the room seemed to vibrate with a significance that Keisha could feel but not understand, the air itself seeming heavier somehow. Mr. Morrison's face went through a series of emotions, confusion giving way to recognition, giving way to something that looked like pain and relief mixed together, and when he finally spoke, his voice was the voice from his nightmares, stronger and clearer than Keisha had heard in months. "At ease, Colonel. I haven't been that person for a very long time." What followed was a conversation that Keisha only partially understood, references to operations and missions and classified details that the officers said they couldn't fully discuss even now. But the general picture that emerged was so stunning that Keisha had to sit down in the chair by Mr. Morrison's bed, her legs giving out as the truth unfolded. James Morrison, the quiet old man who everyone had dismissed as just another forgotten veteran, had been one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history, a special operations legend who had served in World War II, Korea, and the early days of Vietnam, conducting missions so classified that they didn't officially exist, saving countless lives through actions that could never be publicly acknowledged. He had been part of the original groups that would eventually become the Special Forces, a ghost in the truest sense, operating behind enemy lines, gathering intelligence, executing operations that changed the course of battles and maybe even wars, doing the impossible so many times that it became expected. The colonel, whose name was Robert Chen, and who himself had a chest full of medals from Iraq and Afghanistan, explained that the military had been searching for Morrison for almost 15 years, ever since a researcher, going through declassified documents from World War II, had started finding references to a soldier who kept appearing in after-action reports from different units, different countries, different operations that seemed impossible for one person to have been involved in. They called you Ghost because you'd appear out of nowhere, complete the mission, and disappear again, Colonel Chen said, his voice filled with reverence. We found reports of you in Normandy, in the Philippines, in Korea at the Chosin Reservoir, in dozens of places where the official records said you couldn't have been. You saved an entire battalion in Italy by destroying a bridge that the Germans were using to bring in reinforcements. You extracted intelligence from behind enemy lines in Korea that prevented what could have been a massacre. You trained resistance fighters in 3 different countries. And then, in 1973, you just vanished from all military records, listed as retired with an address that turned out to be a post office box that was closed 2 years later. Mr. Morrison listened with his eyes closed, his face showing the weight of memories that Keisha realized must have been crushing him for decades. I did my duty, he said quietly. And when my duty was done, I wanted to be forgotten. I didn't want parades or recognition. I just wanted peace. Colonel Chen nodded respectfully but continued. Sir, the reason we've been searching for you is that documents have been declassified showing that you were recommended for the Medal of Honor no less than 4 times. But because your missions were classified, the recommendations were buried. The military wants to finally, officially recognize your service. More than that, sir, we discovered that you have a military pension and back pay that was never claimed, benefits that have been accumulating for decades because the system lost track of you when you went off-grid. The room went silent as the implications of that statement settled over everyone like snow. Keisha looked at Mr. Morrison, this man she had been caring for, this man who everyone thought had nothing, and realized that he had chosen this life, had chosen anonymity and simplicity over recognition, and whatever wealth might have come with it. I don't want your medals, Mr. Morrison said, his voice firm despite his frail body. I did what I did for the men beside me and the people back home, not for ribbons and ceremonies. Colonel Chen glanced at his fellow officers and then said gently, Sir, with respect, it's not entirely your choice anymore. Some of the missions you were involved in have been fully declassified, and the families of the men you saved have been asking about you, wanting to thank you. There are at least 30 documented cases of soldiers who survived operations specifically because of your actions, and their children and grandchildren deserve to know the name of the man who gave them their families. The conversation continued for another hour, with Colonel Chen explaining that the military had finally tracked Mr. Morrison down through a routine cross-reference of social security numbers and veterans' hospital transfer records, a piece of bureaucratic luck after years of searching. They had discovered him at Riverside 3 days ago, and had spent those days verifying his identity and getting authorization for what came next. Sir, the back pay and pension we mentioned amounts to a substantial sum, Colonel Chen said carefully. More than $800,000 with accumulated interest and adjustments for inflation. Additionally, The military wants to arrange for your care at a specialized veterans facility where you would have access to the best medical treatment available, completely covered, with the honor and recognition befitting someone of your service record. Keisha felt her heart sinking even as she tried to be happy for Mr. Morrison, because of course he deserved all of this, deserved so much more than the basic care that Riverside provided. But the thought of him leaving, of losing the person who had become like family to her, made her chest ache with a grief she had no right to feel. This was good news, she told herself firmly. This was justice being served, even if it came 70 years late. She started to stand, thinking she should leave the room and give them privacy. Give Mr. Morrison space to process this life-changing information without having to worry about the feelings of his caregiver. But his hand shot out and grabbed hers with surprising strength, holding her in place. "Before I discuss any of that," Mr. Morrison said, his cloudy eyes turning toward where he knew Keisha was standing, "I need to know something. What happens to her?" The officers looked confused and Colonel Chen asked, "Sir, who do you mean?" Mr. Morrison's grip on Keisha's hand tightened, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "This young woman, Keisha Williams, has been my family for tea. He passed 18 months. Every single day, she has treated me with kindness and dignity when the world had forgotten I existed. She has sat with me through nightmares, read to me when I couldn't sleep, talked to me like I mattered when everyone else looked through me like I was already dead. She works herself to exhaustion for wages that are insulting, and she does it with grace and compassion that I haven't seen since I watched men throw themselves on grenades to save their brothers. Whatever happens to me next, whatever you want to give me or do for me, I need to know that she is taken care of, because she has taken care of me when she had absolutely no reason to except that it was the right thing to do." Keisha felt tears streaming down her face, her professional composure completely shattered, and she tried to protest, tried to say that she was just doing her job, but Mr. Morrison squeezed her hand and said, "Hush, sweetheart. Let an old man have his say." He turned his attention back to the officers, and when he spoke next, his voice carried the command presence that Colonel Chen had mentioned, the authority of someone who had led men in the worst circumstances imaginable. "I spent my entire life in service to this country, operating in the shadows, never asking for recognition or reward. I'm 97 years old, and I don't have much time left, and frankly, I don't need much. But I have money now, apparently, money I never expected and don't particularly want. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to help me set up a trust or a fund, or whatever it needs to be to ensure that Keisha Williams can finish her nursing school education without worrying about tuition or bills. You're going to make sure she has what she needs to build the life she deserves." Colonel Chen looked taken aback, and Keisha was shaking her head, saying, "No, Mr. Morrison, I can't accept that. I didn't do any of this for money. I did it because I care about you." But the old man just smiled, the first truly joyful smile she had seen on his face in all their time together. "I know you didn't do it for money, child. That's exactly why you deserve it. I've seen enough of human nature to know the difference between someone who cares about what they can get and someone who cares about what they can give. You're the latter, and people like you are rarer than any military medal." He turned back to Colonel Chen and said, "Can you make that happen, Colonel? Consider it my first and only request regarding these funds you say I have." The officers exchanged glances, and then Colonel Chen smiled, a warm, genuine smile that transformed his stern face. "Sir, it would be our honor to facilitate that. We'll get the paperwork started immediately." He turned to Keisha and added, "Ma'am, you should know that what Mr. Morrison is describing is entirely his choice and his right. The military has no claim on his personal funds, only a desire to ensure he receives what he's owed. If he wants to use those funds to help you, that's his decision to make." Keisha was crying too hard to speak, could only nod while holding Mr. Morrison's hand, overwhelmed by a generosity that seemed impossible, that seemed like something from a movie, and not something that happened to girls from her neighborhood who had spent their whole lives just trying to keep their heads above water. But Mr. Morrison wasn't finished. Over the next 2 hours, as the conversation continued and more details were discussed, a fuller picture emerged of what the old man wanted. He agreed to accept some of the military's recognition, not for himself, but because Colonel Chen convinced him that the families of the men he'd saved deserved closure, deserved to put a name and a face to the ghost who had changed their lives. He agreed to a small private ceremony where he could meet some of those family members, but he refused a large public event, refused media attention, refused anything that felt like self-aggrandizement. As for the money, he set up a specific plan. A portion would go to Keisha for her education and to pay off her mother's medical debts, which he somehow knew about even though she had never explicitly told him. Another portion would be donated to veterans organizations that helped soldiers transitioning back to civilian life, and the rest would be used to improve conditions at Riverside Care Home, specifically to increase wages for caregivers and improve the quality of life for patients who had no family advocates. "I'm staying here," Mr. Morrison declared when Colonel Chen again mentioned the specialized veterans facility. "This is my home now, and Keisha is my family. I don't need fancy equipment or prestigious doctors. I need what I have, which is someone who cares whether I wake up in the morning and who makes sure my coffee is how I like it. That's worth more than all the medals in the Pentagon." Colonel Chen tried to argue, explaining the superior medical care Mr. Morrison could receive, but the old man was immovable on this point, and eventually the colonel conceded, instead arranging for additional medical equipment to be installed in room 217, and for specialists to consult with Riverside's medical staff to ensure Mr. Morrison received the best possible care in the place he had chosen as home. The news of what had happened spread through Riverside Care Home like wildfire, and by the end of that day, the staff who had ignored Mr. Morrison or dismissed him as unimportant were suddenly trying to be involved in his care, suddenly remembering that they had always known there was something special about him. Keisha watched this transformation with a mixture of sadness and anger, seeing how quickly people's attitudes changed when they realized someone had value in terms they understood, monetary value and prestigious connections, conveniently forgetting that he had always had value, had always deserved dignity and care regardless of his bank account or his military record. Brenda, the nurse who had told Keisha she was wasting her time, actually had the audacity to approach her and say, "I always knew you had good instincts about people," as if she hadn't been discouraging Keisha's dedication just weeks earlier. The private ceremony that Colonel Chen arranged took place 3 weeks later in Riverside's common room, which had been transformed for the occasion with American flags and a small stage. 23 people attended, all family members of soldiers whose lives had been saved by operations that James Morrison had conducted or been instrumental in. People who had grown up hearing stories about a mysterious soldier who had appeared like an angel and vanished like smoke, never knowing his name until now. There was an elderly woman whose father had been part of the battalion Morrison saved in Italy, a middle-aged man whose grandfather had been extracted from behind enemy lines in Korea, specifically because Morrison had refused to leave anyone behind. A young veteran whose gray tuncle had survived a mission in the Philippines that Morrison had led. One by one, they approached Mr. Morrison, some with tears, some with words of gratitude that spanned generations, all of them wanting to shake the hand of the man who had given them their families. Keisha stood to the side, watching Mr. Morrison handle the attention with grace and humility, deflecting praise and instead asking each person about their loved ones, wanting to hear about the lives that had been lived because of missions he could barely remember through the fog of decades and trauma. She saw him cry when the elderly woman from Italy showed him a photograph of her father, who had passed away 10 years earlier but who had apparently told stories about the ghost soldier for his entire life, crediting Morrison with not just his survival but his ability to come home and build a family and live a full life. "Your father was a good man and a brave soldier," Mr. Morrison said, his voice shaking. "I'm glad he made it home." That's all any of us wanted, just to bring our brothers home. Colonel Chen presented Mr. Morrison with the medals that had been buried in classified files for 70 years. A Medal of Honor for actions in Normandy that had saved hundreds of lives, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses for operations in Korea and the Philippines, a Silver Star, multiple Bronze Stars with Valor devices, and a Purple Heart with 3 oak leaf clusters indicating 4 separate times he had been wounded in action. The old man accepted them with quiet dignity, but when the ceremony ended and the families had left, he took all the medals and gave them to Keisha, saying, "Put these somewhere safe. They're not for me. Maybe someday they'll mean something to someone. Maybe they'll be in a museum or a history book, but I don't need to look at them. I remember what they cost, and that's burden enough." The money came through within a month, processed with a speed that Colonel Chen said was unprecedented in his experience with military bureaucracy, but which he suspected had been fast-tracked by people higher up the chain who wanted to ensure that a legendary soldier received his due before time ran out. Keisha found herself sitting in a lawyer's office, signing papers that established a trust fund for her education, documents that paid off every cent of her mother's medical debt, checks that represented a future she had never dared to dream about. She could go back to nursing school full-time, could focus on her studies without working 70-hour weeks, could give her mother and her brother and herself a life that had always seemed reserved for other people, luckier people, people who hadn't started out with the deck stacked against them. But even as her life transformed, even as she enrolled in a nursing program at Emory University and started classes that she had thought were lost to her forever, Keisha continued working. Part-time at Riverside, continued caring for Mr. Morrison, because some things mattered more than money or convenience. She would arrive before her shifts started and stay after they ended, bringing him books and reading to him, sitting with him during his nightmares, making sure his coffee was still black with 2 sugars. They never talked about what he had done for her in terms of gratitude or debt, because it wasn't about that. It was about family, the family you choose and the family that chooses you, bound not by blood but by the kind of love that shows up every single day regardless of whether anyone is watching or keeping score. Mr. Morrison's donation to Riverside Care Home resulted in significant changes to the facility. Caregiver wages increased by 30%, new equipment was purchased, and a special fund was established to improve quality of life for patients who had no family support, ensuring that everyone received the kind of individual attention and care that Keisha had always believed every human being deserved. The administration wanted to name a wing after Mr. Morrison, but he refused, instead insisting that if they named anything, it should be the Keisha Williams Compassionate Care Fund, designed to give bonuses and recognition to caregivers who went above and beyond for patients regardless of those patients' ability to pay or status or family connections. 6 months after the military officers had walked through Riverside's doors, Keisha was excelling in her nursing program, carrying a perfect GPA and being mentored by professors who recognized her natural compassion and clinical skill. Her mother's health had improved now that she could afford proper medications and regular doctor visits instead of relying on emergency rooms and hoping for the best. Marcus came home safely from his deployment and was able to start college using his GI Bill, talking about becoming a teacher because he said he'd seen enough violence for one lifetime. Everything in Keisha's life had changed, doors opening that she hadn't even known existed. And it all traced back to those 18 months when she had simply chosen to treat a lonely old man with kindness and dignity because it was the right thing to do. But late at night, when she would sit with Mr. Morrison during his nightmares, holding his hand and reminding him that he was safe, that the wars were over, that he had done enough and could finally rest, she knew that the real gift hadn't been the money or the opportunities, as life-changing as those were. The real gift had been the lesson that who you are matters more than what you have, that showing up and caring and treating people with humanity costs nothing, but is worth everything. That the world measures success in dollars and status, but the universe measures it in moments of compassion extended to those who can never repay you. Mr. Morrison had spent his life being a ghost, serving in silence, saving lives that would never know his name. And then in his final chapter, he had been saved in return by a young woman who saw value in him when the world saw nothing at all. Keisha would go on to graduate with honors, would become a nurse practitioner specializing in geriatric care, would eventually open her own facility dedicated to providing excellent care to elderly patients regardless of their financial situation, funded in part by what remained of Mr. Morrison's trust after his passing and by her own success. She would name it Morrison House, and above the entrance would be a quote that the old man had told her during one of their late-night conversations. "We are not measured by the battles we win or the recognition we receive, but by the kindness we show to those who cannot fight back and the love we give to those the world has forgotten." But that was still years in the future, a future made possible by the shocking news that military officers had brought on that August morning. News that revealed that the forgotten old man in room 217 was a hero, that the young caregiver who treated him with dignity was a hero too, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with daily acts of compassion that change individual lives and through them, change the world. On a spring morning 2 years after the officers had first arrived, Keisha sat beside Mr. Morrison's bed, holding his hand as his breathing became shallower, the inevitable end finally arriving despite the best medical care and all the love in the world. He was 99 years old, and he had lived to see the impact of his final mission, the transformation of Keisha's life, and the improvement of conditions for countless caregivers and patients at Riverside, and eventually at other facilities that adopted the model his donation had established. His cloudy eyes opened one last time, and he looked in the direction of Keisha's voice as she read to him from one of the westerns he loved, and he squeezed her hand with the last of his strength and whispered, "Thank you for seeing me, sweetheart. Thank you for reminding this old ghost that he was still human." She held him as he took his final breath, tears streaming down her face, mourning the loss of the man who had been her patient and her teacher and her family, but grateful beyond measure that she had been there, that she had shown up every single day, that she had chosen kindness when she could have chosen indifference. The funeral was attended by over 300 people, a mixture of military officials, families of soldiers Morrison had saved, Riverside staff and patients, and Keisha's family and friends. Colonel Chen delivered a eulogy that detailed Morrison's military service in the limited way that remaining classifications allowed, calling him one of the greatest soldiers America had ever produced, and a man who had lived his values even in obscurity. But the eulogy that mattered most came from Keisha, who stood at the podium in her nursing school uniform and talked not about medals or missions or military glory, but about a man who loved his coffee black with 2 sugars, who had nightmares that he bore with dignity, who showed her that wealth and poverty, fame and obscurity, power and helplessness were all temporary conditions, but that character was eternal, that choosing to care for another human being was never a waste of time, and that the most important inheritance you could give someone was not money, but the example of a life lived with purpose and compassion. As Keisha stood at the grave site watching the honor guard fold the flag that had draped Mr. Morrison's casket, watching Colonel Chen present it to her, because she was the closest thing to family the old man had, she thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment. A young black woman from a struggling neighborhood and an elderly white veteran from a generation, and a life experience completely different from her own, connected by the simple human needs of dignity and companionship and love. The world would have said they had nothing in common, that there was no reason for their paths to cross in any meaningful way. But the world would have been wrong because what they had in common was everything that mattered. A belief that people have inherent worth, that service to others is the highest calling, that showing up every day to do the hard work of caring is the purest form of heroism. Years later, when Keisha would tell this story to the students she mentored, to the young caregivers who worked at Morrison House, to her own children and eventually grandchildren, she would always emphasize that the shocking news the military officers brought that day wasn't really about the money or the medals or the revelation of a hidden identity. The shocking news was the confirmation of something she had already known in her heart, that every single person, regardless of how the world values them, has a story, has dignity, has worth, and deserves to be cared for with compassion and respect. Mr. Morrison had been a ghost in his military service and a ghost again in his final years, invisible to a society that measures people by their utility and their status. But Keisha had seen him, truly seen him, and in doing so had received a gift more valuable than any amount of money could ever be. The story of the black girl who cared for an old man every day, only to discover he was a military legend who left her a fortune, would be told in articles and features, would inspire discussions about caregiving and compassion, and the treatment of elderly veterans, would become a feel-good story shared on social media by millions of people looking for proof that kindness still mattered in a cynical world. But for Keisha, it was never about the shocking revelation or the fairy tale ending or the way her life had been transformed materially. For her, it was about the morning coffee conversations and the late-night comfort during nightmares, the books read aloud and the hands held in silence, the daily choice to show up and care for someone who the world had forgotten but who deserved to be remembered, who deserved to know that he mattered, that his life had meaning beyond his military service, that he was loved not for what he had done or what he could provide, but simply for who he was. And in the end, perhaps that was the most shocking news of all in a world that had become transactional and calculating, where relationships were often evaluated by cost-benefit analysis, and people were valued by their productivity and status. That a young woman with nothing had given everything to an old man with nothing, and in that exchange of pure compassion, both of them had found something worth more than all the medals and money in the world, had found the thing that military service and nursing care and every meaningful human endeavor ultimately comes down to, which is the fundamental truth that we are here to owe each other, to care for each other, to see the divine spark in every human being, and to honor it with our presence and our compassion and our daily commitment to showing up, especially for those who the world has decided don't matter anymore. Because everyone matters, every life has value, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply care for someone who needs caring, expect nothing in return, and trust that the universe keeps better accounts than any human institution ever could.